Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another episode of the OpenShift Administrator Office Hours. I am Chris Short, executive producer of this thing we call OpenShift TV, also a technical marketing manager like the one and only Andrew Sullivan here with me. Andrew, please introduce yourself to the audience. Let us know what we're talking about today.
Yes, sir. Well, hello, everyone. I am, as Chris mentioned, Andrew Sullivan, also a technical marketing manager with Cloud Platforms Business Unit, and this is the Administrator Office Hour. So the Office Hour is a weekly show. It happens Wednesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, where we open up and are available to you for any and all questions, right? This is very much meant to be an Ask Me Anything style of session.
Yeah, so if you got any kind of container, OpenShift, Kubernetes, storage, networking, whatever kind of question you got, if we can't answer it, we'll try and find somebody who can. That's the best part about this show.
We do our best, right? We do our best. So we do, of course, as a result of that, depend heavily on you all, on our audience, on the people who are out there listening to us now. And please feel free, no matter what is coming out of our mouths or being shown on the screen, to ask your questions regarding kind of anything and everything, right? You don't have to be asking about what we're talking about at the moment, and nor do you need to wait your turn, because we can scroll back and look in the chat, and we'll try and address all of those.
There's no turns, there's no nothing, just fire away.
Yeah, exactly. So that being said, we do try to have a topic here that we can chat about between Chris and I in the absence of you all, or while you're pondering your questions or typing them up, as the case may be.
Yes.
So today, there's a couple of things actually I want to talk about. I know, Chris, you and I, as we were preparing for the show, I mentioned the technical thing that I want to talk about today is networking. I'm always... And by networking, I mean, there's a couple of different aspects. I've got a list of questions that I came up with off the top of my head that I see pretty commonly asked. But today is also mid-December, right? It's the 16th. We are quickly approaching the holiday season.
Yes.
Right? And
snow just started, by the way.
Yeah, well,
like on cue.
You're in Michigan. That's expected. I know one of our teammates, Mark. He's up there in the area that's expecting like 18 inches of snow with this current storm.
Good luck with that.
But where I was going with that is, so it's funny that I'm a vendor now, right? I work on the vendor side, right? We work with our customers, right? We help them to understand things and work through things. But for a long time, I was a customer, right? I was an administrator, an architect. And the holidays were not what they are now to me. Right now, it's nice because I take a couple of weeks of PTO. I sit at home. Maybe I play with the kids or just do as much nothing as I possibly can. But when I was an administrator, the holidays, especially that week between Christmas and New Year's, was the craziest time of the year.
Bonkers, absolute bonkers. Yeah.
And I remember for 4 years running, that was when we had like every single day was a set of outages in order to do, maintenance and life cycling. And my favorite one was when I first became a storage administrator. We had a NetApp fast 8030, I think it was.
Nice.
And when we had spec'd out the system, it was 4 controllers, 2 HA pairs. When they had deployed it, they didn't connect the drives, the disk shelves, in a resilient manner. They were single pathed.
Oh no.
And when they had done this, basically they had maxed out each channel so that we couldn't just dynamically add it in. We had to take the whole thing down to be able to add in cards. So, we're talking, many terabytes of storage at the time. This was, gosh, it was 2009, 2010. So
yeah, where terabytes of storage was a ton.
Yeah, and hundreds, maybe even thousands of virtual machines and all of the other apps that were running. Basically, everything had to be shut down, and it turned into, it was something like 8 months of planning. And it was, well, if you're going to turn off the storage, right, that means that we got to turn off the virtual environment. And if we're going to turn off the virtual environment, we may as well turn off this. And if we're going to turn off that, and then it turned, so the power guys got wind that we were turning all this stuff off, and it was, oh, well, we need to do some maintenance. We need to come in and do this.
Oh, fun.
So then it turned into a 24-hour complete site outage where basically none of us got any sleep. None of us, it was And it was all so that we could go in and we had to pull, each chassis, add in, I think, two fiber cards, into the back of the chassis, and run like half a dozen, cables on our part, right? The work that we needed to do, all of that triggered this was like 15 minutes worth of effort.
Right. You needed a 15-minute outage, and then the company found out, and surprise.
Yeah. So yeah, it's the holidays are always a fun and interesting time, when you're an ops team, when you're an infrastructure team, and those outage windows, those maintenance windows, if you're not thinking ahead, they can be brutal. So I'll never forget. I think I've told you this before, Chris. At my previous employer, I did a podcast. For a couple of years, and we had Gene Kim on the podcast, and this was back in 2015-ish. So DevOps was still, not that it's changed, right? It was still new and all this other stuff. So we were at, of course, one of the questions we asked him is, what does DevOps mean? What does it look like? How does that translate into helping the operations team, the developer teams? And his answer was one that still sticks with me as a result of those holiday, maintenance windows, which is DevOps returns the humanity to IT. Right? You stop getting called. Well, hopefully, you stop getting called in the middle of the night. You stop having to work weekends to manage, your maintenance windows and your outages. You stop having to work holidays and all that other stuff. So it's things have certainly come a long way. I think we as an IT industry, our applications have evolved and are helping to make that happen. At the same time, and you can't really see it, I'm wearing a Red Hat virtualization jacket today.
Nice.
And
we are wearing the same t-shirt, by the way.
Yeah, the collaborative to the core.
Yep.
So it's funny in that, I still have conversations with folks today of, if you've interacted with Red Hat in the last 5 years, you have probably heard about containers. And if you didn't hear about containers, you were hearing about containers. And then if you weren't hearing about containers from containers, you were hearing about Kubernetes and containers, right? We spend a lot of time talking about Kubernetes and containers and OpenShift and modern applications, cloud native, and all that other stuff. But reality is, the vast majority of applications are still in VMs, right? They're still traditional monolithic. They're still, the way that we've been doing things for 15 plus years. And it's not going to change overnight. So I'm all of this, all of this wind up, all of this for me to say, I sympathize, I empathize.
Yeah.
And while we all enjoy the holidays, don't forget about your sysadmins, because there's a good chance that many of them are going to be working hard over the holidays to.
Very, very hard. One of the coolest things that ever happened was I was working one of those holidays, and everybody that wasn't working decided to bring in like food or like drink or something. And it was just like, we literally had a table in our break room that was like 10 feet long or something. It was just full of food. It was like, wow, this is awesome.
Yeah, that reminds me, I was in the military, and we were working, it was either Thanksgiving or Christmas, doing a night shift, so 6 p.m. to 6 a.m.
Yeah.
I think there was 12 of us on watch, and we ended up with 4 turkeys and 2 hams, because it was like all of the senior leadership basically was like, oh, these guys are working hard on a holiday. We should treat them, but none of them apparently talk to each other. So
right, yeah, no coordination. No, everybody brought a full meal, basically.
Yeah, so we were incredibly well fed for the next 4 days.
Right. Yeah, that's the best. The incredibly well fed part is the best.
All right, so enough of me running my mouth and rambling about and reminiscing about the days of old. So networking was the subject that I wanted to talk about today, and this is something that if you look back at some of the admin hour, right, the OpenShift admin hour shows, if you look back at some of the ad hoc shows that I've done, or Christian has done, or we've done together, or Reese, right, we talk about networking quite a bit.
Yeah.
And the reason is because, well, it's complex, right? No matter how hard we try, almost every network is a snowflake, right?
Yeah.
There's always
never fails.
Yeah, there's always different things that are, how it's configured and what's available and how the services all interact with each other. And then there's, add on the complexity of, well, we want to deploy our OpenShift this way. We need this type of resilience, or we need this, or we need that. And it's complex, and that's okay. So we want to, and I tried to bring this up as a somewhat not frequent topic, but as a reoccurring topic, just to help answer some of those questions,
right?
And refresh folks' memory, because we also get quite a few new people, right, coming over to OpenShift and learning how all this stuff works.
Yeah, that's
so
important.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
all the whole stack, all 7 layers that OSI reference model are in software now, and it's hard to admit that in a lot of cases, and it's hard to embrace that sometimes, but it's there, and we've got to figure out how to use it.
Yeah, and I'll also add that networking is, when I was on the ops side, I did virtualization and I did storage, but I had to rely on somebody else for networking.
Right.
And that seems very common. It seems like a lot of, ops folks they don't do networking, or their networking is the only thing that they do, and they don't do other things, right? So it's not necessarily a hybrid one. Now, I hope that, and I believe that many of us have a decent understanding of networks, but it's not quite the same as having that external dependency. So it's also one of the most common times, the other one being storage, of course. It's one of the most frequent times where we encounter, well, my admin, my organization, whoever, they only do it this way. They'll only let me do it this way, right? Type of thing. And, oftentimes, and I'm, I have those issues too, right? Of I don't know enough to know how to translate into the words that they want, so I can help them re-architect the network to do what I want it to do, or how I expect it to do. But yeah, so networking is sometimes harder than we expect.
Yeah.
I'll pick on an easy one: DHCP.
Oh,
Right.
easy one. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, there's no wading in. It's right into the deep end here.
Yeah.
So DHCP is, it's something that basically everybody uses at their house.
Right. Like you use it, you don't even know it half the time, right?
Yeah. And if you have Wi-Fi at your house, you almost certainly have, DHCP running. Maybe there's a few of us, masochists who want to do static IPs. I'm not one of those. For everything inside of your house, that's okay.
I have some static assignments, but I don't have anything like my network is not statically defined at all.
No. Exactly. Yeah, I have a few for things like my printer, so that way I, when
consistently can print. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Air print kind of works.
Yeah. So I have a few, but DHCP is common at home. Right. It is not, however, and arguably you could say DHCP is common for desktop networks. Right. We'll see our desktop admins, they'll roll out, hundreds or thousands of new desktops. They just plug them into the network, right? Make sure that port security is, allows the new MAC address, and then it just DHCPs and done. But in the data center, DHCP is still, I wouldn't say it's rare, but it is not common.
Right.
And most often this is attributed to the security team. Right. The security team, for whatever reason, has trepidations about things that can plug things that can plug into the data center network. And to some degree, I get it, especially
I understand completely.
Yeah, you can, sometimes we'll scoff at that and, oh, well, that's what port security is for, so that not just any Yahoo can walk in and plug in. But it doesn't take a physical connection these days, right? I can spin up a virtual machine and, I can have that up and running. I can spin up a container, for that matter, and have things up and running. And it's a very different world. So I understand the trepidation. I don't always agree with it. And it's something that, we can and should work to understand both sides of that coin. And if a compromise can't be reached, which is ideally something like a controlled DHCP rollout, maybe that's static DHCP, maybe, whatever that happens to look like, then we don't really have a choice. So let's talk about DHCP in the context of OpenShift. So DHCP is required only one time, or let me rephrase that, only with one configuration, and that is IPI, so full stack automation or installer provisioned infrastructure. And it is truly required. So regardless of which infrastructure you're deploying to, so whether I'm deploying IPI to vSphere, IPI to OpenStack, IPI to bare metal, on premises, I am required to have DHCP, and I'm required to have DHCP throughout the life of that cluster. So, which brings me to,
you got to have a subnet with DHCP on it, no matter what.
Exactly, and that brings me to the second question, which is, or question 1.5, which is, can I convert my DHCP nodes to static IPs? And the answer there is technically yes. Right, you could go in and use something like a machine config or the enum state operator. Right, there's a couple of different ways that you could go in and do that. One, you would want to make sure that the IPs don't change. Right, so you're just taking the DHCP assigned IP and assigning it as static. But two, you probably don't want to do this, and the reason for that is because it's more complex and more time consuming and more brittle to do that. Right, boot the node, give it a DHCP address. Now I got to go in. Now I got to create a machine config for that node. Now I got to assign it to that node. Now I got to do all of these other things. Right, and then what happens if I need to scale the cluster? What happens if that node goes down? Right, if I have to destroy it and recreate it? Right, there's all of these other things that if you need static IPs, just start with static IPs. And especially with the modern deployments, so things like vSphere UPI, I can assign those IPs through or provide the configuration for those IPs without ever having to go to the console. Right, I can do it through a VM property.
Right.
So DHCP is required for all IPI deployments, and it should remain a DHCP configured cluster throughout the life of it. And now that being said, if you want to use static IPs with IPI, you can't. You can't have a subset of nodes that are statically configured. Right, basically all machine config pools, all machine sets need to be DHCP.
Consistent. Yeah.
Yep. So DHCP can optionally be used with UPI. It kind of behaves exactly as you'd expect. Note that you can use machine sets with UPI. So I know vSphere supports this. I'm pretty sure Rev supports it. I'm almost positive that OpenStack supports it. Bare metal or physical does not. There is no physical UPI right now. But essentially what that means is I deploy a UPI cluster, user provisioned infrastructure, administrator provisioned infrastructure cluster. So why would I do this? Why is this important? So one, with IPI, an on-prem IPI, we use an internal load balancer and some other services that may or may not meet the requirements of your organization. In particular, things like router sharding, right? All of the ingress traffic goes into one router instance. So if you ever need to exceed the capability of that, it would be a bad fit. So I want to use an enterprise load balancer, right? My Citrix, my F5, whatever that happens to be. And I want to be able to more granularly control the placement of resources. So let's use the example of vSphere. I want to have a control plane node in cluster 1, in cluster 2, and cluster 3. And then I want to have worker nodes also spread across cluster 1, cluster 2, and cluster 3. With IPI, they're all in the same cluster. You don't have a choice. Right. So you can deploy UPI cluster, and then after the fact, you can add in machine sets where you can do that node auto scaling. You can do the dynamic configuration, or creation and destruction of those nodes. Do note that when you do that, however, it's going to require DHCP, right? Because effectively the machine set doesn't know how to statically assign IP addresses. So those nodes would need to be DHCP booted. So DHCP required for IPI, DHCP optional for UPI, unless you're doing machine sets to do dynamic node management, in which case you need DHCP. And then what the docs call bare metal, but not bare metal IPI, which I try to refer to as the non-integrated installation methods, is really much like UPI, your choice, right? You can do DHCP or static IP assignment.
Right. So with DHCP as an optional thing in UPI or a non thing in UPI, what stumbling blocks have you seen folks hit with that?
So most of the time, it comes down to like with using DHCP or not using DHCP.
Not using DHCP.
So a lot of times it's just I want to automate, the deployment of my cluster. I want to automate, all of these things as much as I possibly can. Why is there not an API, or why is there not a way for me to feed that information into my nodes?
Right.
Which with some installation methods, VSphere being one of them, you basically can, right? If I have automation that is deploying the OVA, I attach that VM property and that has the IP equals, line in it.
Right.
And it's up and running. If you're doing physical servers though, right, there is no way for us to pass that information into them. So usually the stumbling block is that automation piece,
Right.
I want to be able to automate the deployment, the creation, the management of the clusters, and with static IPs.
Can always be a joy.
Yeah. So I will extend the DHCP and say that you should also have DHCP doing dynamic DNS updates.
Right.
So effectively, because the nodes will send their host name with the DHCP request, right? So when the DHCP server, it'll respond back with its IP address, and then the host responds back with its ACK. And then the DHCP server will update DNS with that host name and IP, right? Forward and reverse lookup. So that is important. That is used by OpenShift for a number of different things. I have heard, but have not personally validated, that with IPI, the on-prem IPI solutions, you don't need to have the dynamic DNS updates. But I've also heard of some folks having issues with that. So the background there is with on-prem IPI, we deploy a load balancer service, which is Keep Alive D and HA proxy based. And then we also deploy a multicast DNS service, which all of the nodes, that's what they use to do their node to node hostname lookups. So theoretically, it's not necessary. In practice, I have heard mixed results at best. So having DHCP do the dynamic DNS updates is the best solution. Christian, I can technically add a static host to an IPI install. Yes, as far as I know.
To an IPI install, yes.
Yeah, I don't think IPI would know the difference. At the same time, I don't know. Yeah, that would be an interesting one.
Yeah.
I'm running IPI clusters without DNS updates, no problems until now. Oh, that's not a good sign.
Yeah, that's I'm waiting. He's like, is there a typing still thing? Like, what kind of problems have you had, Frank?
I hope it wasn't literally just now when I was saying that I cursed it. Yeah, it won't create a machine set. That's what I was thinking, Christian. I'm wondering how it would be associated with a particular machine config pool,
right? Yeah.
And how it would get its configuration from there. So let's see, blah, blah, blah. So let's talk a little bit about, so while we're on the subject of DNS, and I'm pretty sure Christian, this is why Christian started chiming in. He heard me talk about DNS.
DNS. Oh, here I come to save the day.
So while we're on the topic of DNS, so what DNS entries are required? So let me do something here. Let's share our screen. And
Frank says no problems yet.
Oh, that's good to hear. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So first, I'm gonna blow this up.
Yes, make it readable, please.
Enlarge it. How about that?
Embiggen it. Yeah.
I was reminded of a funny story the other day of a guy who, and I think it was a Home Depot. They called the bomb squad because some guy walked into the bathroom and was like, "I'm gonna blow this place up," and he was talking about using the bathroom, and the other patrons misinterpreted that.
So. Okay. Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah.
We have no explosives on the program.
Yeah, no.
No special effects either. Yeah.
So let's pick on vSphere here. So DNS entries that are required. So this is going to be different based off if you're doing IPI or UPI, and effectively the bare metal or non-integrated is going to be the same, but we can visit that as well. So let's look at installing a cluster on vSphere. This is just the generic, right? The very basic. I'm going to accept all the defaults of installing IPI to VMware.
Nice.
And if we scroll down through here, one thing to note while I'm on the page here, this is confusingly worded. We don't require NSX-T here. It's just if you're using NSX-T, make sure it's one of these versions.
Right.
Or later, excuse me. All right, so let's scroll down here to our networking requirements. So you can see we only have 2 required IP addresses. So these are effectively IP addresses that are assigned to the cluster that are on the same subnet, but outside of the DHCP range as the nodes. And then we have our required DNS records. And you'll note that these are only forward lookups for the 2 IP addresses that we assigned above, one for API, one for ingress. So that's all that we need to do, or all that we need to manually create in the external DNS system, right? The nodes don't necessarily need to have external lookups. As Frank pointed out, right, it should work, but again, your mileage may vary, so I don't want to promise that it will work. Where those are helpful are if you are trying to connect into the nodes. So for example, if you want to connect to, right, you expose a node port or something for your application, or bad practice, right, SSH into the node, and you want to use the node name for that, you would want it available in external DNS. And yes, I kind of mumbled there, bad practice to SSH. Normally you would want to do like a node debug instead of an SSH.
Yes. Node debug is awesome. And JP Date is just kidding about his question. So, but the question was, for folks that missed it, how about nested networking, NSX-T with OpenShift SDN on top of it?
That's actually a good question. That is not one that we haven't heard a number of times. So there's 2 ways to look at it. So one is you're more than likely going to be fine if you layer the SDNs. So if I'm using NSX-T for VM to VM communication, and then OpenShift SDN or OVN Kubernetes on top of that. So where it potentially becomes an issue is at the edge cases around things like latency and throughput, especially throughput. Right. So the higher I'm driving my throughput, if I'm approaching multi-gigabit type of throughputs to my or between nodes, right, crossing the double SDN, that's where it can start to encounter issues. So the other aspect is if you do have issues, your network guys will hate you. And I say that because it's double encapsulation. So you have to pull apart 2 sets of packets, if not 3 sets of packets, because there's still a physical layer underneath, right, in order to try and figure out what's going on. So it can make troubleshooting dramatically more complicated.
Nightmare. Yeah. No, as a former network admin, I can imagine, the woes.
Yeah. So yes, so VMware NSX is fully supported as an SDN, right? You can drop in and fully replace the OpenShift SDN with NSX-T in that respect. So, and I think just be conscious of the compatibility versions.
Right.
So NCP version 3.0.2 works with OpenShift 4.5. And NCP 3.1 works with 4.5 and 4.6, I believe.
Nice.
So DNS records for IPI, right? Those are the only 2 that you need, right? Effectively, the host's DHCP can optionally update external DNS, not required. Should work without doing that, unless you're trying to do like an external, right? I'm trying to go from my desktop to a node or something like that directly. So for IPI, on the other hand, this changes. And let's see here with user provision and infrastructure. And let's do the same thing. We'll scroll back down here. and we will get to eventually. I know. I'm sorry for scrolling, everybody. I know it can be hard to follow in the
funny.
stream.
I have a Logitech MX3 mouse that I bought to help with wrist and everything because I'm on computer more nowadays. And its scroll wheel has like a infinite scroll, like fly kind of capability, and that's the setting I use for docs. It's like, go there, stop.
Yeah, I started to suggest a reorganization of the docs, and it quickly got out of hand. So to make them a little easier to read, yeah.
Oh boy.
So I finally got down here, table 6, required DNS records. You'll notice that this is a much longer table, right? We have our API and we have our star.apps, but you'll notice that there's a couple of other records. So this API int is also inside of there. But note that that only needs to be accessible, right? It says over here, it only needs to be accessible from the other Kubernetes nodes. It should not be publicly accessible. Right. There's a very good reason for that. So anybody unauthenticated can hit that API int machine config port and pull down what is effectively the ignition config for your machine config pools. So you do want to protect that API int endpoint and limit access to that to only the appropriate nodes. So down here, we also have our, right, so when we're doing UPI, when we're statically assigning those DNS entries, we do need to create entries for each one of the nodes that's going to be in the cluster, both forward and reverse records for those. Yes, definitely try to use the KISS methods.
So yeah, Bronislav asked, is it possible to do UPI with self-hosted load balancing for API Keep Alive D like IPI has? And Christian comment is not possible now, but it's something we're looking into, kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. Yeah, so it is not possible nor supported today to do that, although it is something that they're looking at. Inversely, they're also looking at making the IPI load balancing stuff more flexible as well. So where we first expect to see that surfaced up is going to be with the assisted installer. So today, if you do the assisted installer with IPI, right, it's basically a standard IPI. What they expect to be able to do is configure, right, hey, I want IPI, but I want to use this external load balancer, right? Don't deploy the internal one, or I want to use, right, these other services for those types of things. So yeah, unfortunately, there is no internal load balancer for UPI. That being said, I'll also take a moment to give Christian appropriate kudos for the helper nodes. So
yes, hang on, stand by.
You have a macro for it.
I've
got one of those stream decks where you can just mash the button and it
no,
automatically.
I don't have one of those yet. Notice I said yet because I said to my wife earlier this month, one of these would be incredibly helpful.
So yeah, they are. I considered, because they're hard to find right now. I considered just getting a what are those ones that the musicians use? Anyways,
it's the same premise, but yeah, it's
and hacking it to do that.
Ooh, that'd be interesting.
Anyways, so yeah, so the helper node, if you don't have a load balancer, right? If you don't have a physical or virtual, Citrix F5, whatever you want to use, Christian created the helper node, which is a set of automation to deploy those services, including you can granularly, like, hey, I've already got DNS and DHCP, just turn those off, and then utilize the HA proxy config that's in there. I use it in my lab. I deploy, I don't know how many clusters a week, a month inside of there, and the helper node is extremely helpful. Helper node v2 is in alpha, so everything is containerized on CentOS, I think, or RHEL. I don't know what it is now.
I forget which one.
Yeah.
I'll look real quick, or Christian will tell us.
I guess it's containerized, so it doesn't matter, right?
Right. Like the OS is important to a point. RHEL, CentOS 8. That's either one.
So
using Podman and Firewall D. So RHEL, CentOS 8, Podman, Firewall D. Those are your
There we go.
3
UBI.
prereqs. Yeah.
So one of the most recent additions that the docs team did was add in these sample DNS zone files. So if you are a bind user, or if you are familiar with the bind format, this is a really simple way of kind of orienting yourself as to what DNS records are needed for a particular cluster. And then they provide both forward and reverse records for that. So the other thing, and the only reason why I keep up with this, or why I'm aware of this, is because they asked me to review this. So inside of here, they added, and I'm going to scroll up here to the TOC and see if there's a direct link.
I have to do that myself.
Let's see, creating. Yeah, here we go.
There you are.
So down here in step 5, they moved the documentation for how to do that static IP config with a machine property, a virtual machine property in vSphere. They moved that into the correct place in the documentation. Nice. So it's been a few weeks now, or a couple of shows. I showed doing this here on the admin hour. We can see if we can dig up the link to that at some point. But so I showed how to do this. Before, it was only loosely documented in the release notes. So we've gotten that fixed now, and you can see that.
Awesome.
Note that you don't need to use govc or govc. You can go directly into the virtual machine, and my vCenter is turned off right now, so otherwise I'd show it. But you can go directly into the VM, through the vCenter GUI and set the correct VM property inside of there. You don't need to do through govc or through PowerShell or PowerCLI or anything like that. So the other thing, I don't know that it is completely supported yet, but you can attach the Bootstrap ignition config file in the same way as a virtual machine property instead of as a VApp property. Right. So VApp properties are limited in size. The virtual machine properties are, but they aren't. Basically, VMware says that they are, but we don't know how big they can actually be. Just be aware that, it's something like it's something like 8 megabytes is, and we don't like.
Not
the email chain
tested.
The email chain that I saw, which was like, hey guys, how much info can we pack into here? They're like, well, we don't know the real limit without causing issues, but try and keep it under 8 megs.
Okay.
So I think our guys are looking at how to, they're adding the testing and the validation to be able to fully support doing that without the VApp property. I think no promises, because roadmap, and I'm also not.
You think?
So that will actually make it easier to do some automation, right? Because I can now add that directly to the VM as opposed to having to go through that VApp property nonsense. So I think that's a net good thing. I will also add in one thing to be aware of is that when you add data as a VM property, it is stored in the VMX file. So if you have any concerns about somebody accessing your data store and being able to access those VMX files, if you're concerned about sensitive data being in, that ignition file, even, yes, it's base 64 encoded, whatever that means from a security perspective, but it would be accessible in that manner.
Right.
All right. So DNS, pretty straightforward. For IPI, you only need the 2 DNS entries for ingress and for apps, or excuse me, ingress and apps are the same. Ingress and API.
API, yes.
For UPI, you need a bunch more. So in addition to those 2, you need the API-INT internal, as well as entries for each one of the nodes in your cluster. Note that as of OpenShift 4.4, you no longer need the pointer records and the SRV records for etcd.
Thank you.
So yeah, that came when we moved to using the etcd cluster operator to instantiate the cluster. And we can talk more about that some other time. All right.
It does make life a lot easier for the general admin, because it's not like, hey, by the way, these records that I rarely use, I'm going to ask you to instantiate and explain why I need them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's SRV records, despite being, I mean, they're not uncommon. They're used fairly frequently. It seems like most people aren't familiar with creating them, right, and stuff like that. They're often created automatically. So,
Mm,
all right.
absolutely.
So the next thing I wanted to discuss is SDNs.
Right.
So as of OpenShift 4.6, Red Hat now ships and supports two SDNs. So the first one, which is the default, is OpenShift SDN.
Hmm.
So OpenShift SDN is VXLAN based, pretty standard, et cetera, right? Nothing unusual about it.
Yeah.
So the second one, which is new with 4.6, is OVN Kubernetes. So
Yes.
OVN Kubernetes is a Geneve-based, right, SDN,
Hmm.
and we really did this for a couple of different reasons. And I think I may have talked about this before, but just to refresh our memories. So the two reasons, or the two main reasons that I'm aware of, are one, a very Red Hat reason, which is community. Right? OpenShift SDN is only used by OpenShift, and the community around it is therefore only OpenShift. So SDN, excuse me, OVN Kubernetes, on the other hand, is used by a much, much larger community, both in and out of Red Hat.
Right.
So for example, OVN is used by OpenStack. It is used by Red Hat Virtualization, right? It is used by many other projects out in the community as well. So this gives us much better, much robust, right? Much more integration with the community for doing things like finding and fixing bugs, right? Et cetera.
Hmm.
So the other reason is because OVN works across both Linux and Windows nodes.
Hmm.
So as we add Windows container support, as we add Windows nodes into our clusters, OVN is the network of choice for doing that. And I won't steal
Nice.
Christian's thunder because Christian is the Windows containers guru
Yes.
in my book.
We should have Christian on one day to talk about Windows containers and like make him do all the work, and we just sit back and laugh.
It's just a day that ends in Y, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it depends who's working, but yes.
We just Christians are he's our execution team. We'll put it that way, right?
Yeah, no kidding. He's our strike team, for lack of a better term. Yeah.
So yes, Windows containers, Christian, and I know that he probably is already. I see at least one mention of Windows containers in there. Yeah. So those are the two SDNs from Red Hat. However, they're not the only SDNs available.
So right, there's a number of them.
Yeah, and so unfortunately, with OpenShift 4, we moved away from the docs having links to all of our partners and their supported plugins, both for networking as well as for storage, CNI and CSI. Excuse me. So
got two questions in chat if you want.
Yes, please.
Okay, so first from JP Dade, how did you get around Windows authentication on the Windows worker nodes, or is that still there? I don't know the answer to that.
That is a Christian question.
Christian just responded. The Windows node will only have one account, the admin account. Okay, there you go. There's that. And then next question. I'm still running a 311 cluster with a subnet plugin to provide project-based egress IPs. Is it possible with 4.5 or higher, or must I change the default SDN plugin again?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. So egress IPs are possible. Whether or not there is a plugin that can assign those dynamically, I don't know. Going back to our
let me search
tongue-in-cheek joking a moment ago, Christian actually is the one who has the most experience with the egress IPs on our side. So Christian, I hate to keep leaning on you when I know that this.
Let me send on the Zoom link real quick.
Yeah,
how about that?
So yeah, let's see if we can find out some information on that one.
You want to do
here
your
before the end of the show?
Yeah.
So I'll while Chris is reaching out to Christian, I'll finish my thought around SDNs. So SDN as well as CSI plugins are not listed in our documentation. We rely on our partners. That being said, there's a couple of different places where you can find some additional information. So one of those is the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
So if I go to simply marketplace.redhat.com and we make it larger.
Thank you.
So if we look inside of here, there's a couple of different product categories in here, including networking. And this will
Christian
bring up.
says he's at the gym listening. I forget that he's 4 hours or 3 hours behind us.
Oh, that guy trying to be healthy and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one place where you can go, right, where you can get some additional information around available plugins, available capabilities from a network perspective. So for example, here's traffic from a load balancer that you can deploy into the cluster. So none of these are SDNs, however. So I also believe we can go to catalog.redhat.com. And if we look in here and we look at our certified software, and in particular, we go to the certified operators page here, we will find kind of the list of all of the certified operators that are available from inside of OpenShift. And again, we'll find a number of different things that are interesting here. So you see, I've already got the networking tag checked on here. So F5, Strix ADCs, right, Nginx. And as we come down here, here's our NSX operator, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of different options available through here. Still not all encompassing. I think that we have a slide available to our field folks, but I don't know, and I have a long-standing question out of how do we disseminate, right? What's the best way to disseminate that information? Because ultimately, you know, like you haven't seen any mention of Calico, right? Of Tigera, right?
Right.
But if I do a Calico OpenShift, right? If I just do a simple duck search of this, right? There's a number of things that come up, not the least of which is a blog post from earlier this year, right? Or excuse me, a webinar from earlier this year showing the integration between the two companies, right? And Calico Tigera is a fully certified, fully supported plugin for OpenShift.
Right.
Here's the link I was looking for, right? Install an OpenShift cluster with Calico.
There you go.
So a lot of times it comes down to, you know, I want to use this SDN vendor. Is that supported by OpenShift? And our response is, well, please ask the SDN vendor.
Right.
Just as many times, however, we get asked, well, what are my SDN options? And, you know, we don't have a good list of that. So hopefully, and if there's any field folks who are listening, if you have a list that is publicly available that we want to share, that we want to, you know, make as an unofficial thing.
There's only a few choices to pick from.
Did you really print that out on a?
I did.
8.5 by 11. Like that's.
I needed it as a prop for show. Yeah.
each icon is 4 pixels by 4 pixels.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm gonna keep using it.
So yeah, thank you, whoever posted that on YouTube.
I did. Can you actually see it? No, not really. So Laxman has a question like, how do pods get IPs? I don't know if he means in general or in an OCP cluster. How do pods get their IP?
Yeah, so it depends on the SDN.
Right.
So for something like Calico that is using, you know, layer 3, it is going to assign them. Let me rephrase that. Most frequently, it's going to be the CNI that is assigning them. You can connect a pod directly to an external network, right? It could get a DHCP address from your public DHCP server. But most often it is going to come from the CNI. So what does that actually mean? So with OpenShift SDN, which I will admit is the one that I am most familiar with, essentially it uses a subset of the IPs assigned to your network address. All right, so let's start at the beginning there. So I'm going to switch over to my command line here because I want to look at an install config.yaml. So this install config, and let me make this just 1 or 2 lines longer. So this install config here has, let me move it up as well, this networking section here. So this is providing information into the installer about what subnets, what networks I want you to use. And there's some important information here. So the first one is the machine network CIDR. So this is the subnet that the nodes are expected to receive an IP address on. So if my node has one network adapter, right, it's expected to receive an IP address, either statically or dynamically, that is on this network. If it has two network adapters, or 3 or 5 or 50 network adapters, there should be at least one that gets an IP address on this network. Why is that important? It will choose which network interface to set up things like the SDN based off of that value. It is also really, really important, arguably the most important, if you're using a cluster-wide proxy. So the cluster-wide, if you're using a cluster-wide proxy, it will automatically set this network to be not proxied. So we see a lot of issues with folks who are doing proxies, and they don't configure this machine network CIDR, and they end up, the cluster's trying to proxy to get back to itself, which of course doesn't work. And note that if you're doing IPI, on-prem IPI, it doesn't ask you for this information. It defaults to 10.0/16, and unless you go in and correct it, right, it won't use the correct one. The only time that you would notice that, because if it has a network adapter that isn't on this, right, basically no network adapter falls under this machine network.CIDR, it basically chooses the first one, is if you're using a proxy. There's a couple of other features as well. So the cluster network here is the range of IP addresses that it will use to assign to nodes for pods. So let's break that down a little bit. So I've got this 10.128/14 block of IP addresses. For every node that joins the cluster, it is going to assign a /23 out of this range to that host. And then that host will use that block, that /23, to assign IP addresses to each container as it comes up. Right. And that is how the IP address gets assigned, or that is where it is assigned from. So remember, with OpenShift SDN, we're effectively using IP tables with Masquerade. So we're doing NAT to access those pods on that cluster. And it's all handled inside of that node.
Nice.
So the last one that we have here is the service network. So anytime you create a service inside of the cluster, it will get an IP address assigned from this particular range. So generally speaking, you want to make sure that these are not externally addressable IP ranges, right? So if your enterprise network is using 10.128/14 or some subnet thereof somewhere publicly, you would want to avoid that network.
Yeah.
It will probably work. You might encounter some quirks depending on a couple of things, but you would definitely want to make sure that these two are not.
I feel like the quirks would be so horrible you would. Right, like
at best it's going to work, and then you'll intermittently have problems. It's
bingo. Yeah.
This pod landed on this node, and that now it just stopped working. What happened here? Why is this? Yeah. So
yeah,
generally speaking, yeah, you want to avoid those being publicly used. So hopefully that helps to answer your question. Effectively, it is going to depend on the CNI. If we're talking OpenShift SDN, it is controlled by OpenShift SDN itself, which uses IP tables to do the assignment. You can create custom CNIs, right? So you could use like the, so let's switch back over here. Which one of these is my documentation? Here we go. So if we search for, and I'm trying to think of the term that I want. And I think that there is, like here's OVN Kubernetes. I want to say that you can essentially create additional CNIs because Multis. And with the other CNIs, you can use policies for things like Mac, I'm trying to think of the name of them. It's Mac something.
not talking about MAC address.
Mac VLAN. That's the one I'm.
There you go. I was like,
hey, it's early on Monday.
Yeah, right.
So see here, we have simple Mac VLAN, right? And I can do various configuration. So effectively using Multis, I can define a new CNI that maybe uses Mac VLAN and give it a DHCP range that it will assign IPs as containers as pods join that particular CNI. So if you want to customize that, that's where that would come into play.
Awesome.
Was there another question?
I
see Christian advocating for .NET Core.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way forward, right, for a lot of people in the .NET world. Please consider moving that way very quickly, because I feel like Microsoft is going to push harder and harder as the years go on.
.NET Core is also cross-platform, so
right. So you'll be kind of in a better position long term as well by doing that. So just keep that in mind. There's benefits to it long term.
Yep. Yeah, I'm a PowerShell guy, so PowerShell,
nice.
After version 5, when it's .NET Core based, can run on my Mac. It can run on a Linux host. It can run anywhere, which is really quite convenient.
Yeah. Very, very nice.
Okay, so SDNs, kind of the core stuff. We're down to only just a couple of minutes left.
Yeah,
so
I was gonna time check you there, but good job.
Yeah. so really, the last thing that I want to touch on, and it's a pretty big topic that has a really terrible answer, and that is, how do I choose an SDN? And it really comes down to, well, what are your requirements? If you don't know, then basically go with the default, right? that's what it comes down to, in my opinion. If you have specific things that you want to do, right, then take that feature list and compare it to what the vendors offer. So let's look at Calico. So if we go to the Calico homepage here, right, and we look at, they have all of this, why use Calico, right? Well, they have all of these capabilities, all these features, right? So putting pods directly onto the external network, everything is layer 3 based. There's no encapsulation, right, which helps reduce complexity. And Calico is the one that I'm second most familiar with, which is why I can talk a little bit about them. Their security policies, right? All of these things, it's effectively, do I need these? If yes, then okay, go from there. If you don't know, if you don't need those things, then much to JP Dade, who said, apply the KISS principle, which is, the simplest and the most robustly tested is often going to be the safest. And I say robustly tested because with OpenShift, we test every single release thoroughly using both OpenShift SDN as well as SDN or OVN Kubernetes.
There's a question here. Does memory management in .NET work well with containers? No issues like what the JVM had? I have no idea on the answer to that one. I would assume there's not that bad of an issue.
Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with that. That's a Langdon question from a developer perspective. I don't think so. Well, let me rephrase that. I would expect it to behave exactly the same. So if .NET is, managing the heap, it is doing trash collection, et cetera, or garbage collection, et cetera. You can tell I'm not a developer. I would expect it to behave the same across all of those platforms. Right. However, that is a gigantic assumption based off of, at best, anecdotal experience. So I would definitely recommend, and if you would like to, please reach out to me via social media or email. So Practical Andrew on Twitter or andrew.sullivan at redhat.com. If you'd like to reach out to me, we can connect over with Langdon and get that question answered. Or you can watch the Level Up Hour. So the Level Up Hour happens Wednesdays 9 a.m.
9 a.m. Yeah.
Correct. So, and ask the question live. And he's really way better suited to answer something like that than I am.
Yes. All right. So thank you all for joining us. So Tanawa says there were issues with JVM spinning up pods, couldn't share the inode underneath. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Reach out to Andrew and we'll get you linked up appropriately.
Yeah, please do. Memory profile proliferated. Oh, that sounds terrifying from a security perspective.
Yeah. So yeah, let's get some email going there, please, Tanawa, and we'll get your question figured out. All right, folks, coming up here in a few seconds, we've got the OpenShift Commons briefing with Profit Store, and we'll be switching over to that here in just a few seconds. So thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for another stream.
Thank you, and have a happy holidays. We'll see you
Happy holidays,
in
everyone. Yeah.
3 weeks, I think.
I think you're right. Yeah, 3 weeks. See you, everybody. Have a good one.